Pride is the beginning of sin, the first impulse and movement toward evil. Perhaps indeed it is both the root and the foundation, for every sin begins from it and is maintained by it. There is therefore no evil like pride. It renders a man a demon, insolent, blasphemous, perjured, and makes him desirous of deaths and murders. The proud man always lives in troubles, is always angry, always unhappy. There is nothing which can satiate his passion. If he should see even the king stooping down to him and prostrating himself, he is not satisfied, but is the more inflamed. For as the lovers of money, the more they receive, so much more they want. So also the proud, the more honor they enjoy, the more they desire, for their passion is increased. For a passion it is, and the passion knows no limit, but it only stops when it has slain its possessor.
Hello and welcome to the Theology of the Rose podcast. I am Tristan.
And I'm Pierre.
Prost.
Prost.
We are here to talk about pride, but also about one figure in church history that is worth reading up on. He has this weird Greek accent. Who is he, Pierre?
Yes, Tristan, a very good question. You would note my excellent mimicking of my big fat Greek weddings accent to introduce the person of John Chrysostom, from one Johannes. Pierre means Petrus Johannes, and John, being a Greek, John Chrysostom, being a Greek man, is also a Johannes. He was known as the Golden Mouth. That's what Chrysostom means. It's one of the early church fathers that was world renowned for his preaching. And we have this short excerpt from his homily, his first homily on Second Thessalonians, to lead us into this concept of pride. And I mean, the Bible is full of passages that refer to it. One that strikes one immediately is from the book of Proverbs. Pride comes before the fall. It's even a part of our language. And the Chrysostom here seems to imply that pride literally comes before the fall of the individual. It ends with his death. At the end, it ends with the death of the proud man. But in the pages of the Bible elsewhere, we have a pride that comes before another type of fall, don't we, Tristan?
Exactly. We have the intellectual kind of pride, the pride of reason, the pride that we have when we think we know and understand so much about the world that we don't even need to know God anymore. We don't need to know the creator of this world that we live in. And where, ironically, you can find this kind of pride a lot is with theologians like me and Pierre, who think we have read the Bible so well and understand it so scientifically perfectly that we don't need to reflect on ourselves, or that we don't need to have some kind of relationship with this God of ours. And this intellectual pride is something I actually read about in different articles in the internet, but I've also experienced it a little bit when I preach or when I've talked to people in normal communities other than the academic communities at universities. I realized, life is sometimes really real and not so theoretical at all. And those theories that we had to learn in theology were and are still valuable, but in a practical sense. And then we have the pride of morality, or the moral pride, which of course we can probably clearly think of very quickly, that there are these desires that we have. We have jealousy. We want to be more or better than other people. We don't want other people to succeed. We have greed. We chase after money. We desire rich and wealthy lives. And then you have so many more vices, which John Chrysostom also unpacks in his sermon. But what I would take even more importantly would be the pride that we have when we think our moral achievements or our moral behavior can somehow balance out all the bad behavior that we've once done in our lives. And that if we are simply good enough in one part of our lives, we can kind of ignore this other part of our life that is actually, or this other monster that is growing inside of us.
And
There may be different things that we try to hide. Yeah.
And that kind of brings us to the religious type of pride, right? This thinking that by doing the right things, we somehow.
Exactly. Which in this time of Lent, where we think about the suffering of Christ or the suffering of people as Christians, we can often think of fasting as some kind of offering that we make to God, some religious practice that makes us right with God or puts us in right standing towards God. But that is, of course, not what fasting is meant for in the Christian faith. It's not meant to balance the books or to make everything okay again. That is what Christ, of course, suffered for. But what fasting is there for, of course, is to reorientate ourselves. It's a gift to us to reorientate our minds, not to save us fully.
One thing that you said, I think, very, very neatly sums up these different aspects of pride, or these different expressions of pride. You started with the theological, the moral, the religious, and then you used these two words, or this little phrase, saying that we then come to a point where we think we can make ourselves right with God. It's almost as though these different forms of pride steer down on self-righteousness. And
Exactly.
perhaps we could revisit some of these points of pride and just reflect on them again. Like you begin with theological pride. I'm immediately struck by the fact that the very first theologians are guilty of this, and maybe it's why the church fathers regard it as the Ursünde, the original sin, the root and foundation of sin, because Adam and Eve,
Yeah.
the first two persons who were tasked with saying something of God, saying something to God, the first theologians, was pride that preceded their fall, very much so. And theologians throughout the ages have been, one could say, keeping the name of the first theologians high in our tendency towards pride. I know one
Mhm.
very deeply blue-eyed German philosopher theologian, Hegel,
Yes.
is
Yes,
someone who you feel is guilty of this sin, this particular form of
exactly.
pride, isn't it?
Exactly. Uh, so even Chrysostom talks about the philosophers. He says to his uh, congregation, "You can go to the philosophers and those people who know a lot about history and what, and get some answers from them. But if you don't think about the nature of humanity, the prideful and the sinful nature of humanity, often then you're going down a yeah doubtful path." And one of the philosophers that I bracket in this paragraph from Chrysostom in my head is Hegel, because I think Hegel has led some of us theologians to believe that we are developing new ideas and new systems of thought that are better than all the previous centuries, and the traditional theology should just fall away, basically, because we have now developed to another stage. And Hegel was the one who said time develops linearly, or that human society, as it moves with the spirit, I hope I still understand him correctly, um, is developing and moving away from these other systems in the past that were so less functional, less beneficial to human life. But I think in theology, we especially have the task of actually responding to this pride
Mhm.
uh, by thinking what Chrysostom says in his sermon as well, is that our reason, our philosophies, our systems of thought that we think can move us towards something else and away from something else that we had in the past in our church and theology. I think to that, Chrysostom responds with the idea that we should know God, that instead of thinking we ourselves make us righteous, only God, the lowly God who became human, can make us righteous.
Yes, and I'm actually still. You've thrown Hegel on the table. I'm stuck with the guy now. Because one thing that strikes me, Tristan, is that pride is precisely so dangerous because it's misplaced at the end of the day. And Chrysostom also draws these examples, as you mentioned, in his sermon. He mentions that all of these rich men who have built their massive houses and amassed their fortunes, and yes, what then? It all comes to nothing. It gets ruined by a night of gambling, or an earthquake comes and destroys his entire, how could one say, uh, amassed a portion of wealth. I mean, the whole book of Job kind of reflects on the the feebleness of our possessions, the things in which we take pride and from which we take pride. But also so with Hegel. I mean, his magnum opus, the phenomenology of spirit, I think, he regarded it as the final production of philosophy. It answers finally all of the questions. There will be no philosophy hereafter. And how many centuries later are we still doing this? Hegel was just wrong. And this is one of the great dangers of theological intellectual pride. It's grievously misplaced. We we misdiagnose ourselves and look like fools a few years later.
Exactly. Of course, I also thought during my studies, and even now sometimes, that I have so many answers to all of these questions and problems that people have. But if you really have to solve problems, then it's not that easy.
The school of experience has taught you otherwise, and me as well.
Yes,
And
exactly.
you've referred back to Chrysostom, and it really is something that I think the church fathers, the ancients, they got it more right than we tend to do. I'm reminded of an article that we treated during our studies in Stellenbosch about the rationalistic tendency of apologetics today. We've kind of accepted the premise of Enlightenment philosophy when we say that
Yes.
we have to give good reasons and concise propositional statements that prove our faith. That's the purpose of apologetics. It's to demonstrate the validity of the Christian faith and to beat people over the head with the facts we possess. But this article made the observation that, to an extent, that is quite unchristian. If you look at the early church fathers in the time of Chrysostom, Augustine, Anselm, yes, they were very, very competent theologians, thinkers, philosophers. But when it came to the matter of bringing man before God, that was experiential. They wouldn't tell you,
Yes,
here is my book of arguments on De
exactly.
Trinitate. They would say, come and join us in the liturgy. Come and approach God, experience Him, because that is kind of the way, as you've mentioned now, that's like the antidote to pride. It isn't hammering more intellectually.
Yes, that's a great point. That's exactly what I also read in Chrysostom's sermon. But also, I actually read a lot of writings from Ambrose of Milan as well. And the one big thing that I also got from him was humility towards
Oh,
people, also. So, not just letting go of your pride before God, but also of your pride towards people around you. And he did things like gifting the poor people all of the gold in his church, basically. Or, yeah, did a lot
wow.
of things that were just absolutely crazy and so counter whatever the rich people wanted. Really humble, yes, and not at all absorbed in this intellectual business
Yes.
that we sometimes run.
But sometimes it's stuck in, right? I mean, and it does flow over. It's like that which goes on in our heads. It flows over into the moral realm. It flows over into the religious realm.
That's
It's so easy for us to already being convinced that we can make ourselves right with God by having the right set of beliefs or by thinking rightly
Yes.
about Him, it's so easy to then go
Yes.
over and say, well, we can also make ourselves right before God by being the right type of person and being good enough. I mean, isn't that one of the great temptations? To prove it to ourselves and to God and to others that we are worthy of grace. And
Exactly.
that's so counter to the whole, well, definitely counter to the whole Reformation impulse, and I would say accordingly
It
counter to
is.
the Slankracht, to the massive
Yes.
thrust of the entire Bible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Reformation theology. I mean, I also thought of that now. Of course, what we learned from Martin Luther was that our self righteousness often comes from this idea that we are theologians of glory, basically, that
Yes.
we have the right set of beliefs, as you just said, da 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 da, and the right systems, and we believe the right kind of thing about God, like that He's triune and those doctrines, but we are actually not theologians in practice. We are not theologians of the cross who also go through suffering and who know that life is not as glorious and beautiful all the time, and that our thoughts or our systems of thought can't always just fix things. Um, yeah, the Reformation definitely speaks against this pride, this kind of pride. Yeah.
Definitely. And now that you throw Luther into the mix, and I recall that one of these articles that we read in preparation used a very striking illustration of Luther and St. Paul. He said that both Luther and St. Paul were Olympic climbers of ladders. And I thought, what in the world does
Yeah.
this mean? And the
Yes.
explanation of it was quite interesting. He referred to the fact that if we conceive of our relation to God as progressing on this Jacob's ladder, that we have to get
Mm.
one rung higher, and so often we reach a place where we think, okay, well, we're higher than the rest of humanity, or the majority of humanity, or just my neighbor.
Yes.
So I guess this is fine. It's fine to be here. And then obviously
Exactly.
we haven't even really gotten past the first rung. But he
Exactly.
mentioned that both St. Paul, I mean, Paul was a Pharisee's Pharisee. He did it good and proper. And Luther, when
Mm.
he was still an Augustinian monk, same story. He he was a
Yes.
monk's monk, the most committed. If I think he puts it this way: if I could save myself with my works, then I should have been saved. God help me, because he
Yes.
really did go to the extremes regarding it. But I think it brings us back to this conceiving of pride as the original sin. I love the illustration of sin as a man and woman, being turned in upon themselves, like navel gazing, looking
Exactly.
looking into yourself, the quite sad picture that you have when looking at your navel, looking to that as the solution, the be all and end all of your existence, and thinking it's oh so grand. Now,
Mm.
I think when pride, theological, moral, and religious, steers down onto self righteousness, it brings us to a place where we try to climb Jacob's ladder whilst navel gazing. And no wonder we struggle so
Yes.
much. I mean,
Yes.
but I think it
You
brings
put
us.
it so wonderfully. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. We do climb up a ladder. Even today, I thought after I finished my exam and I passed, I thought, yeah, I'm actually pretty much okay. Then I have to remind myself, wait, do you still have this thorn in your back, like Paul says?
That's
um,
a very good, and
don't think you're more further up the ladders than other people.
indeed, and perhaps on
You
that
shouldn't
point,
be.
you again mentioned it prior. We are now in the season of Lent, so perhaps a reflection or two from your side as to what is the solution to pride. I think Chrysostom, he says the beginning of pride is not to know God, but then like the antidote to pride, what does that look like in this
Mhm.
Lenten season?
Exactly. I think first of all, it looks like humility. Of
Mm.
course, humility not starting by looking at yourself and changing your attitude, but looking at Christ, the Son of God, who made himself lowly and who suffered for us, and then suddenly turning and changing your focus and perspective. Chrysostom says that in his sermon, that if we are to have any chance against the devil, basically, or against the Antichrist, then we have to actually first accept this God who made himself human for us in the most humble sense. So, of course, the first antidote to pride is never, of course, arrogance or some kind of practice that we do better, but I think it starts with Christ. And I don't know if you have a thought of one.
You've given me a thought. Indeed, by saying it starts with Christ, it immediately struck me that this is applicable just like that to the story of Paul and to the story of Luther. Paul did not get rid of his pride after a good, thorough introspection. It started with his being encountered by Christ on the road to Damascus.
Yes.
And that led to a proper ability to look at himself. Obviously, he was struck blind first, and then the scales fall off his eyes, and he begins to see himself for who he really is, the poorest of all sinners. And same thing with Luther.
Exactly.
It was with his encounter with the gracious God we have in Christ that allowed him to look at himself rightly and see, it's not as wonderful as I was trying to make it out to be, but what a grace that it doesn't have to be all that wonderful.
Yes, exactly.
Incredible.
And that's kind of why I wanted to talk about it again with you, is because it also made me think this topic of pride. Of one of the best quotes I've ever heard is, the antidote to shame is not pride, not making yourself bigger than you really are, but the true antidote to shame is humility. And what I wanted to get at in this conversation was also that our pride often actually is the source of sin, but it also stems from the shame that we feel from other people around us, within ourselves, that we think we should feel in front of God. And we respond to that often with the antidote that we think works, which is pride, through reason, through moral practices, through little fasting rituals or whatever. We think we can have the perfect antidote, but the perfect antidote, according to this Uncle Iro, I got it from the quote from Winner, but also many other people, is that humility is the first antidote to shame. Yeah.
Great spectrum of intellectuals we've quoted tonight.
Exactly. Uncle Iro is one of the best.
I want to say that this would be an excellent note on which to end off the podcast, but you've unfortunately reminded me of one more thing that actually should have been said a little bit earlier, and it is this last point on moral pride and on shame. You know, this is from personal experience. I had a tough, honest conversation once, and during the course of this tough, honest conversation, it was brought to my attention that I have a tendency of holding myself to a different standard than I do other people. And this is a very common human tendency. We all have it to an extent. We're harder on ourselves than we are onto others. And I always thought that this was due to a good Christian tendency to meekness. But it was brought to my attention that pride can be bloody deceptive. It is because of pride that one holds oneself to a different standard. You think you are secretly better than all of these other four sinners. And
exactly.
I mean, again, your quote to end it all off comes as a beautiful ribbon in this little package. That no, the antidote to shame is not more pride, just in a different form.
Exactly.
It is true humility.
Exactly.
And which begins with knowing God. So, thank you. This was a great session.
Yes, thank you. So you wrapped that up very well.
Cool.
For the next, it's goodbye.
Until the next time. Cheers.
Cheers.